The humid air clung to Daiki's skin as he crept through the dense forest, his heart pounding in his chest. Sunlight filtered down in patches, illuminating his way to the river that flowed just beyond the thick trees. He knew he shouldn't be here. The village elders had warned children for as long as he could remember to stay far from the river's edge. But Daiki couldn't resist. He had heard stories about this place his entire life, whispers of mysterious creatures lurking in the waters. And as he grew older, his curiosity had only intensified. The elders called it the Kappa River. They said it was home to an ancient creature that lurked beneath the water's dark surface, waiting to drag unsuspecting souls to its hidden depths. Some of the children in the village believed the stories and avoided the river, terrified of the unseen monster. But Daiki was different. To him, it was just another bedtime tale, a way for adults to scare children away from dangerous places. Standing at the riverbank, he felt a thrill of defiance surge through him. He was finally here, the murmur of the flowing water filling his ears. The river was calm, its surface almost glassy, reflecting the trees and sky above. There was nothing sinister about it, Daiki thought. He kicked off his shoes, feeling the cool mud squish between his toes, and rolled up his pants. Just one step in. Just a quick dip, he told himself, ignoring the faint prickle of fear in his stomach. With one last glance over his shoulder, he dipped a foot into the river. The water was icy, much colder than he expected, and it sent a shiver through him. But there was something exhilarating about it, like he was crossing a forbidden threshold, stepping into a place he was never meant to go. He waded a bit deeper, the water now lapping at his calves, when something cold and solid brushed against his ankle. He froze, heart hammering, his eyes wide as he stared at the murky water below. The brush against his leg could have been a branch, a piece of debris carried by the current. But then he felt it again, stronger this time, a firm grip wrapping around his ankle. Panic flared in his chest, and he stumbled backward, yanking his foot out of the water, but the grip only tightened. He yelped, struggling as the unseen force pulled him off balance, sending him crashing into the water with a splash. Under the surface, Daiki opened his eyes, blurry images swirling around him. And there it was. A face, a distorted, horrifying face with wide, staring eyes and a wicked, stretched grin. The creature's skin was a sickly shade of green, its long, thin arms reaching out toward him. He tried to scream, but the river swallowed his voice in a burst of bubbles. With a sudden jolt, he felt the creature's grip loosen, and he kicked desperately, breaking the surface of the water, gasping for air. Scrambling to his feet, Daiki stumbled out of the river, his legs shaking as he pulled himself onto the muddy bank. He looked back, expecting to see the creature rising from the water to pursue him, but the river was calm, deceptively still, as if nothing had happened. Daiki's body shook with fear, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. He looked down at his legs, expecting to see bruises, marks, anything to prove that the creature had really touched him, that it hadn't all been a terrible dream. But his skin was unmarked, his legs as bare as they'd been before. For a moment, he stood there, trembling, feeling the weight of the creature's cold touch lingering on his skin. He could still see its awful grin, those wide, unblinking eyes staring into his soul. Whatever that thing was, it had let him go. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly escaped. Daiki couldn't shake the chill that clung to him as he stumbled back through the forest. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see that terrible green face grinning back at him through the trees. Each shadow felt like the twisted arm of the creature, reaching out to drag him back to the river's depths. By the time he reached his home, he was breathless and trembling, the memory of the Kappa's grip still fresh in his mind. His mother was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables, and she looked up with a frown as he stumbled inside, his clothes soaked, muddy, and clinging to him. "Daiki, what on earth happened to you?" She dropped her knife, rushing over to him. "Did you fall into the stream?" "No, it was—" Daiki's voice wavered, and he struggled to find the words to explain. "It was the kappa. It grabbed me, Mama. I saw it in the river." His mother's face softened, and she sighed, gently patting his damp hair. "Oh, Daiki, what have I told you about listening to those old stories? There's no such thing as a kappa. It's just something the elders say to keep children out of dangerous places." Daiki felt a swell of frustration and desperation. She didn't understand. This wasn't just some story. He'd seen it, felt its hands on his ankle. But his mother's gentle smile and dismissive tone made his words die on his lips. She wouldn't believe him. No one would. Not unless they'd seen it too. "Listen to me, Daiki," she said, crouching down to his level. "You're just tired, that's all. A little imagination running wild. Go change out of those wet clothes, and I'll make you something warm to eat, all right?" Daiki opened his mouth to protest, but then closed it, nodding numbly. What was the point? She wasn't going to believe him, no matter what he said. He could still feel the kappa's cold grip on his skin, but to everyone else, it was just his imagination. He trudged to his room, peeled off his wet clothes, and changed into dry ones. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his feet, still half expecting to see marks. Something, anything. That might prove what he'd experienced. But his skin was smooth, unblemished, as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a fever dream. But Daiki knew it wasn't a dream. He could still see the kappa's wide, staring eyes and that twisted grin every time he closed his eyes. Later, as he sat at the table, picking at his food, he tried once more to tell his father. He recounted the events, the eerie silence of the river, the cold grip pulling him under, the face he'd seen in the water. His father listened quietly, his brow furrowing, but then he chuckled, ruffling Daiki's hair. "Maybe you've been listening to the elders a bit too much, Daiki," he said. "They do love to tell scary stories to frighten kids away from trouble. I did the same thing when I was your age. Told my parents I saw a ghost near the shrine just to scare them. You'll laugh about this one day." Daiki's heart sank. The adults wouldn't believe him, no matter what he said. Even though the fear was still raw and gnawing at him, he could tell they saw it as nothing more than the imagination of a child who'd wandered where he shouldn't have. That night, Daiki lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his heart still racing. His room felt darker than usual, and the silence around him was thick, pressing down on him like a weight. Every creak and groan of the house sent a jolt of fear through him, making him glance around the room, half expecting to see the kappa lurking in the shadows. As he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, a strange sensation washed over him. He felt a faint, prickling touch on his shoulder, like cold fingertips grazing his skin. He jerked awake, sitting up in bed and gasping, his heart thundering. But when he looked around, there was nothing, only shadows cast by the pale moonlight streaming through his window. Shivering, he pulled his blanket tightly around himself, feeling more alone and scared than ever. He wanted so badly to believe it was just a nightmare, a figment of his imagination. But deep down, he knew the kappa had left something with him, something invisible and insidious. And, as he lay awake in the dark, Daiki feared that it was far from over. The days passed in a blur, but for Daiki, each one seemed longer and heavier than the last. He tried to keep up with his friends, running through the village, playing tag, and helping his mother with small chores. But he grew weaker with each passing day. The world around him felt different, duller, and darker, as if an invisible weight were pressing down on him, dragging him closer to the ground. His friends started to notice too. "Daiki, you're so slow now," one of them teased as he stumbled and fell during a game. "What happened to you?" Daiki tried to laugh it off, forcing a smile as he stood up and brushed the dust from his knees. "I'm just tired," he mumbled, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Ever since that day at the river, his body felt strange. Drained, like something inside him was slowly being pulled away. One afternoon, while walking home alone, Daiki caught sight of his reflection in a puddle by the roadside. He stopped, staring down at himself, trying to recognize the boy looking back at him. His face was pale, his eyes dull, and his skin seemed thinner, almost translucent in the dim light. He touched his cheek, feeling the chill of his own skin, and shivered. He didn't look like himself. Feeling a surge of fear, he bolted the rest of the way home and locked himself in his room. He stood before his mirror, running his hands over his arms and legs, searching for any sign of what the kappa had done to him. He peeled off his shirt, examining every inch of his skin, but he found nothing. No bruises, no marks, no sign of the creature's touch, but he could feel it. The cold grip still lingered, invisible but ever present, like a shadow he couldn't escape. He touched his shoulder, where he'd felt the strange prickling sensation at night, and shivered. Was it possible that the kappa had cursed him somehow? Left some unseen mark on him, one that was slowly sapping his life away? The thought twisted in his mind, dark and unsettling, growing stronger with each heartbeat. That night, he lay in bed, his body trembling as he stared up at the ceiling. His skin felt colder than ever, and he hugged himself, trying to chase away the creeping chill that seemed to be seeping into his bones. He closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would bring him some peace, but as he drifted off, the nightmares came. In his dreams, he was back in the river, the water dark and heavy, pressing down on him. He could feel the kappa's grip around his ankle, pulling him deeper into the depths. He struggled, but his limbs were weak, and the water felt like ice, numbing his body as it dragged him under. He opened his mouth to scream, but the river swallowed his voice, filling his lungs with cold, murky water. And there, in the darkness, he saw it again. That terrible face with wide, gleaming eyes and a twisted grin that stretched too far across its face. He jolted awake, gasping, his body drenched in sweat, though his skin still felt icy to the touch. He clutched his chest, feeling his heart race, but as the terror of the dream faded, the heavy, invisible weight settled over him again, like a damp shroud he couldn't escape. Daiki tried once more to tell his mother. He described the dreams, the cold touch, the feeling that something was draining his life away. But she only shook her head, patting his shoulder reassuringly. "It's just your imagination, Daiki. You had a scare, that's all. Once you get some rest, you'll feel better." He wanted to scream, to make her understand, but he could see the doubt in her eyes, the gentle smile that told him she didn't believe a word he was saying. Days slipped by, each one leaving Daiki weaker than before. He started spending more time alone, unable to keep up with his friends, who grew tired of his constant exhaustion. His parents watched him with growing concern, but they still dismissed his stories of the kappa, convinced he was simply ill or stressed. One evening, as the sun began to set, Daiki sat by his window, staring out at the distant forest and the river beyond. He could still feel the creature's cold, relentless grip around his ankle, pulling him down, down, down. It was as if the kappa had left a piece of itself with him, an invisible, malevolent mark that no one else could see. A tear slid down his cheek as he sat there, alone in his fear and despair, wondering if he would ever feel like himself again, or if the kappa's curse would keep pulling him deeper into its darkness until he disappeared altogether. In the quiet of his room, with the shadows deepening around him, Daiki realized that no one was coming to save him. The kappa's grip was tightening day by day, and he had no way to fight back, no one who believed his story. He was utterly, helplessly alone. Daiki's mother had been noticing the changes in her son over the past few days. His laughter, once so bright, had faded to a hollow sound, and his eyes, once full of curiosity and mischief, seemed dull and tired. She tried to brush it off, reassuring herself that he was just going through a phase. but a growing worry gnawed at her each day. He barely touched his food, eating only a few bites before pushing his plate away. His limbs looked thin, almost fragile, as though the spark of life was being drained from him. One evening, as the golden light of dusk spilled through their kitchen window, she set a bowl of soup in front of him. Daiki took a sip, his hand trembling slightly as he held the spoon. But after only a few swallows, he set it down and stared blankly at the table. "Datesh," his mother said, reaching out to touch his hand. "What's wrong? You haven't been yourself lately." He looked up at her, his face, a deep, haunted look that unsettled her. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The kappa, it's real. It grabbed me that day at the river. It put something on me. I can feel it." Her heart twisted with a mixture of worry and disbelief. She wanted to believe him, to take his words seriously, but her rational mind insisted that it was impossible. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Oh, Daiki, you had a fright, that's all. Sometimes, when we're scared, it feels like things are real, but they're only in our minds." "But it wasn't just in my mind," he whispered, his eyes wide and pleading. "I feel it, Mama. It's like it's taking something from me." A chill ran through her, but she forced a gentle smile, pushing down her own unease. "You're tired, my love. You need to rest and eat well. I'll make you your favorite tomorrow, and you'll feel better, I promise." Daiki lowered his gaze, a deep sadness settling over him. She could tell he felt alone, that he wanted so badly for someone to believe him. But what was she supposed to say? She was his mother. She was supposed to protect him from his fears, not indulge them. That night, Daiki had another nightmare. His mother awoke to his cries, her heart pounding as she rushed to his room. She found him curled up under his blanket, shaking, his face pale as moonlight. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his cheeks. "It was there, Mama. I could feel it, dragging me into the river again." She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as she stroked his hair. "It's okay. It was just a dream," she murmured, though her words felt hollow even to herself. His body was cold against hers, his skin clammy to the touch, and she couldn't ignore the creeping fear in her own heart. Something was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to believe it was because of a creature from a river. As she held him, Daiki whispered something that sent a shiver through her. "It said it would take me back, that I belonged to it now." She pulled away, looking into his terrified eyes. She opened her mouth to reassure him, to tell him it was all in his imagination, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she just held him tighter, trying to chase away the darkness that seemed to cling to her son like a shadow. The next day, Daiki's condition grew worse. He could barely stand, his steps shaky and uneven, as though he were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. His face had taken on a pale, almost grayish hue, and his eyes were rimmed with dark shadows, as if he hadn't slept in days. She watched him with growing horror, feeling helpless as he grew weaker and weaker, slipping away before her eyes. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she decided to take him to the village healer. As she helped him out of bed and wrapped a blanket around his frail shoulders, she could feel his thin bones beneath her hands, as though his very essence were fading. They arrived at the healer's home, a small, warm hut filled with the scent of dried herbs and incense. The healer, an elderly woman with wise, piercing eyes, listened to Daiki's mother as she explained his symptoms. She frowned, studying Daiki closely, her gaze lingering on his hollow cheeks and glassy eyes. "When did this begin?" the healer asked, her voice a quiet murmur. "A few days ago," his mother replied. "After he went to the river." At this, the healer's eyes darkened, and she exchanged a long, serious glance with Daiki's mother. "The Kappa River?" Daiki's mother nodded, her heart sinking as she saw the healer's expression change to one of understanding and fear. The healer took Daiki's hand, examining it carefully, as though searching for something unseen. "It's not just a story, is it?" Daiki's mother asked, her voice barely a whisper. The healer shook her head. The river has a spirit, she said slowly. A creature that doesn't let go once it has touched you. It's rare, but there have been stories. Her gaze shifted to Daiki, and her expression softened with pity. It leaves a mark. A mark we can't see, but one that binds the spirit to those it touches. And it drains them slowly, until there is nothing left. Daiki's mother felt her knees go weak, her mind reeling. Is there anything we can do? The healer hesitated, looking at Daiki with a sad expression. I don't know. The river spirit does not give back what it takes, but there may be rituals, offerings that could appease it. It's dangerous, but it may be his only hope. Daiki looked up at the healer, his eyes wide with a faint spark of hope. But his mother's heart was sinking, a cold dread settling over her. She had dismissed his fears, convinced herself it was nothing more than imagination, and now she feared that time was running out. They left the healer's home in silence, Daiki's mother clutching his hand tightly, her mind racing. She would do whatever it took, make any offering, follow any ritual. She had to save her son. But as they returned home, Daiki seemed weaker than ever, his steps unsteady, his breathing shallow. And as they neared the river, she noticed a strange, haunted look in his eyes, as if he were being pulled toward it, drawn to the water that had cursed in him. She tightened her grip, pulling him close. That night, she sat beside his bed, watching him sleep fitfully, his breath shallow, his skin pale as moonlight. She prayed silently, hoping that somehow her love and presence would be enough to protect him. But deep down, she knew that the Kappa's hold was too strong, and that unless they could break the curse, it would continue to drain him, taking him deeper into its darkness, until he was lost to them forever. As the first light of dawn broke through the window, Daiki stirred, his face etched with fear. He reached for her hand, his voice barely a whisper. Mama, it's coming for me. She held him close, her heart breaking, her mind racing with thoughts of the ritual and the healer's words. She would do whatever it took to break this curse, even if it meant facing the creature herself. Because now, she believed, and she was terrified. The following morning, Daiki's mother awoke early, a renewed determination tightening her resolve. She would not let the river claim her son. She gathered the items the village healer had suggested for the ritual: a bundle of dried herbs, a small wooden effigy, and a bowl of rice as an offering. Her hands trembled as she packed each item, feeling the weight of the healer's words echoing in her mind. The river spirit does not give back what it takes. Daiki lay in bed, his breathing shallow, his skin almost translucent, a ghostly pallor that frightened her to her core. As she approached, he looked up at her with glassy eyes, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his lips. Are we going to the river, Mama? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Yes, my love. We're going to make an offering. The river will see that you mean no harm, and it will lift the curse. But as she lifted him from his bed, she could feel how frail he'd become. His body was lighter than it had been just days ago, as if each step toward the river was drawing the life out of him. Despite her fear, she held him close, whispering words of comfort as they made their way through the village, the morning sun casting long shadows across the path. As they neared the riverbank, Daiki's breath grew shallower, his hand clutching hers tightly, his gaze fixed on the water with a haunted intensity. His mother felt her own strength falter as they approached the river's edge. The water flowed calmly, its surface reflecting the sky, but she could sense something malevolent beneath its placid exterior, a darkness that hungered for her son. They reached the spot where the healer had instructed her to perform the ritual. With trembling hands, she knelt by the water, setting the wooden effigy on the riverbank and lighting the bundle of herbs. Smoke curled up into the morning air, carrying her whispered prayers as she pleaded for the river to release its hold on Daiki. She placed the bowl of rice before the water, hoping that this offering might be enough to appease the kappa. Daiki watched, his eyes growing duller with each passing moment, his breaths coming in faint, uneven gasps. He looked to the water, his lips moving as if in silent conversation with something unseen, something only he could sense. As his mother completed the ritual, she reached out, clutching his hands and whispering fervent prayers. "Please," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "give him back to me. He is just a boy. Let him live." For a moment, there was only silence. The river remained still, its surface reflecting the sky and trees around it. Daiki's mother held her breath, waiting, hoping that something, anything, would happen to indicate that her prayers had been heard. But then, Daiki's grip on her hands loosened, his fingers slipping from hers. She looked down, heart pounding, and saw that his eyes were closed, his face pale and motionless. Panic seized her, and she shook him gently, calling his name, but he didn't respond. His breathing had slowed to a faint whisper, barely perceptible. "Daiki!" she cried, her voice trembling. "Daiki, wake up!" A ripple spread across the surface of the water, disturbing the calm. She looked up, her heart pounding, and saw something emerge. A faint shimmer, as though the river itself was watching her, taunting her. The ripple grew, spreading outwards, and a dark shape began to form beneath the water, rising slowly toward the surface. She pulled Daiki close, shielding him as best as she could, feeling a cold terror grip her heart. She knew it was the kappa, the creature that had marked her son, drawn now by the ritual, by her desperate pleas. The shape rose higher, just beneath the water's surface, and she could see a faint outline. A twisted figure with long, thin arms and an eerie, wicked grin that sent chills down her spine. Its eyes glowed with a sickly light, locked onto her and Daiki, as if savoring their fear. Desperation surged within her, and she clutched Daiki tightly, whispering a final plea. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, let him go." But the kappa's grin only widened, and she felt a wave of hopelessness wash over her. She could see now that the creature had no intention of releasing her son. The river had claimed him, marking him as its own, and no ritual, no offering, would be enough to break its hold. As the kappa began to sink back into the depths, its gaze still fixed on them, Daiki's body shuddered slightly, his head tilting back as he gasped for air, his eyes fluttering open. "Mama!" he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It's not going to let me go." She held him close, tears streaming down her face, feeling the cold grip of despair settle over her. She could sense the truth in his words. The river's hold on him was too strong, its curse too deep. The kappa had marked him, and now it was only a matter of time before it claimed him entirely. They stayed by the river's edge for what felt like hours, Daiki's breathing growing fainter with each passing moment, his body growing colder. She whispered words of comfort, trying to soothe him, though her own heart was breaking, her spirit shattering with each shallow breath he took. Finally, as the sun began to set, she gathered him in her arms, carrying him away from the river, her steps heavy with grief. She didn't know how much longer he had, but she would hold him close for as long as she could, treasuring each moment, each heartbeat, until the river finally claimed what it had taken. As they returned home, Daiki rested his head against her shoulder, his eyes half closed, his body limp. She could feel his heartbeat slowing, fading, a faint rhythm that seemed to mirror the river's quiet, relentless flow. And as the darkness closed in around them, Daiki's last words echoed in her mind, haunting her with their quiet certainty. "It's not going to let me go." She hardly slept, hovering over him, whispering reassurances that she didn't believe herself. Sometimes she would catch him gazing out the window, his eyes fixed on the distant forest where the river lay hidden, as though it were calling to him, drawing him back. One night, as she sat beside him, holding his frail hand in hers, Daiki's voice broke the silence. "Mama," he whispered, his voice faint, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. "I'm tired." She tightened her grip, choking back a sob. "I know, my love. I know. Just rest. I'm here." Daiki's eyes fluttered closed, a soft sigh escaping his lips, and she watched as he slipped into a restless sleep. She couldn't bring herself to leave his side, afraid that if she looked away, even for a moment, he would vanish. Her heart ached, her mind replaying the healer's words over and over again. The river spirit does not give back what it takes. As dawn approached, the room filled with a cold, pale light, and Daiki's breathing grew shallower, his chest barely rising. She held him close, brushing her fingers through his hair, whispering desperate prayers to gods she hadn't thought of in years, willing him to stay. But as the first rays of morning light touched his face, Daiki's body stilled, his breath slowing until they were barely there. His hand slipped from hers, and she could feel his body grow heavy, lifeless. "Daiki?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she shook him gently. "Daiki, please." He didn't respond. Her heart shattered, her chest tightening with a grief so deep it felt like a physical wound. She clutched into her chest, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face, her sobs breaking the morning silence. She had failed him. She had let the river take her son. But then, through her tears, she noticed something strange. Daiki's hand, which had been limp and cold just moments before, was damp. She pulled back, staring in confusion as she saw small, wet footprints on the floor, leading away from his bed and out of the room. Her heart pounded, a strange mixture of fear and hope surging through her as she followed the footprints. They led her through the house, each step small and delicate, like a child's, wet as if they had been formed by someone just out of the river. She stumbled down the hallway, her mind racing, her breaths shallow. The footprints continued outside, marking a faint trail through the grass, leading toward the forest. She hesitated, dread pooling in her stomach, but something compelled her to follow. She pushed through the thick brush, the morning air sharp and cold, her footsteps quickening as she neared the river. There, at the edge of the water, the footprints ended, vanishing into the gentle ripples of the river's surface. She fell to her knees, her heart pounding as she searched the water, hoping, praying to see Daiki's face, his small figure emerging from the depths. But there was nothing, only the quiet flow of the river, its surface calm and serene, as if it hadn't claimed her son, hadn't stolen his laughter, his life. She stared into the water, her tears mingling with the gentle waves, her voice barely a whisper as she called his name. Daiki. Silence. She felt a cold breeze pass over her, and in that moment, she could have sworn she saw a faint reflection. A small, ghostly figure standing beside her, his face pale and sad, his eyes filled with the same haunted look they'd held in those final days. He lifted his hand, as if to wave, and she reached out, but her fingers passed through the empty air, the image vanishing as quickly as it had come. The river had taken him, claimed him as one of its own, and though she would return to the riverbank day after day, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, to hear his laughter echoing across the water, he would never return. In the village, the story of Daiki's disappearance would become legend. A tale of a boy who had defied the warnings, who had gone to the Forbidden River and paid the ultimate price. His mother would tell the story to every child who dared stray near the water's edge, warning them of the creature lurking beneath, waiting to claim those who ventured too close. And every morning, as the sun rose over the river, she would look for those small, wet footprints, the only trace of the boy who had once been her son. She would watch the river with a mixture of love and terror, knowing that somewhere in its depths, Daiki was there, lost to her forever, yet always close, forever bound to the Kappa's embrace.